The Battle of Quebec in 1775 was one of the most important and daring military engagements of the early American Revolution. It marked the culmination of the Continental Army's ambitious campaign to enlist Canada in the rebellion against British rule. This battle, fought on December 31st, 1775, was more than just a military contest. It was a pivotal event that influenced the northern strategy of the American Revolution. Despite their hopes, the Americans suffered a crushing defeat, and their dreams of Canadian alliance and expansion were severely hampered. To understand why American troops were fighting in Quebec at all, we must first examine the early stages of the Revolutionary War. Following the opening battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 and the subsequent siege of Boston, the American colonies declared open rebellion against British rule. The Continental Congress, which had formed the Continental Army under George Washington's command, recognized the strategic importance of defending Canada. At the time, Canada was a British colony, having been ceded by France to Britain in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War. The majority of its population, however, remained French-speaking and Roman Catholic, and some American leaders hoped they could be persuaded to join the revolt against the British, particularly given lingering resentment of the recent conquest and British mismanagement. Securing Canada provided several strategic advantages. First, it would prevent the British from launching military campaigns southward from their bases in Quebec and Montreal. Second, it would grant Americans access to critical supplies and trade routes. Third, it may add a 14th colony to the revolutionary cause. With this in mind, in the summer of 1775, the Continental Congress authorized a two-pronged invasion of Canada. One force, led by General Richard Montgomery, was to advance north through the Lake Champlain corridor and take Montreal. The other, commanded by Colonel Benedict Arnold, was to lead a daring expedition through the Maine wilderness to attack Quebec City from the east. Montgomery's expedition had an early success. In November 1775, he captured Fort St. John's and marched on Montreal with little resistance. This left Quebec City as the final major British stronghold in Canada. Meanwhile, Arnold's expedition, which went in September 1775, encountered unimaginable hardships. The route through Maine was riddled with swamps, mountains, frigid rivers, and dense forests. His men faced starvation, disease, and exposure. Many people turned back or died. By the time Arnold's force appeared near Quebec City in November, it had been significantly reduced in size and strength, but morale remained surprisingly high. When Arnold's force arrived in Quebec, Montgomery's troops joined them. The combined army consisted of around 1,200 men, although many were sick, malnourished, or unfit for battle. In contrast, the British defenders, led by Governor-General Guy Carleton, numbered around 1,800 people, including regular British troops, Canadian militia, and several hundred Royal Navy seamen stationed on the St. Lawrence River. Carleton had taken precautions to fortify Quebec City, which was surrounded by massive stone walls and offered a commanding view of the river valley. The British possessed superior supplies, artillery, and defensive positions. Rather than lay siege, which was nearly impossible during the Canadian winter and given their limited supplies, the American commanders devised a daring and risky strategy: a direct assault on the city during a snowstorm. The idea was that the storm would obscure their movements and catch the defenders off guard. The storm arrived on the night of December 30th, 1775, and the American attack began early the next day. The plan was to divide the force into two primary columns. One, led by Montgomery, would attack from the south near the St. Lawrence River, and Arnold's column would advance from the north along the St. Charles River. Both were to meet in the lower town and then travel to the heart of Quebec City. Montgomery's column advanced along the narrow path known as the Anse au Foulon, hoping to capture a barricade and enter the lower town. Unfortunately, the British were ready. As Montgomery's men approached, a cannon hidden in a blockhouse opened fire, killing him instantly, along with several officers and soldiers. The remaining troops, leaderless and stunned, fled in confusion. This left Arnold's column, which was still moving through the narrow streets of the lower town, without critical support. Arnold's assault had begun with promise. His men fought their way through barricades, exchanging musket fire with British defenders on the snow-covered streets. During the advance, Arnold was shot in the leg and had to be carried away. Captain Daniel Morgan, a resourceful and courageous officer, assumed command. Morgan pressed on and even managed to infiltrate parts of the lower town, seizing some British positions. However, The dense urban environment hampered the Americans. The British counterattacked from multiple angles. With Montgomery's column shattered and reinforcements unable to break through, Morgan and his men were trapped. After several hours of fierce resistance, they were surrounded and forced to surrender. The battle resulted in a complete disaster for the Americans. About 60 people were killed and more than 400 were apprehended. The British suffered far fewer casualties, with around 20 dead and 50 wounded. Carleton's defense was hailed as a remarkable victory, and the morale of the British garrison skyrocketed. The Americans' hopes of seizing Quebec and rallying the Canadian people to their cause were crushed. The remaining American forces, demoralized and freezing, kept up a loose siege around Quebec throughout the winter and spring, but they lacked the strength to launch another assault. The Canadians remained largely neutral or loyal to the British Crown, as reinforcements from the colonies arrived too late to be of significant help. By May 1776, British reinforcements from Europe had arrived in overwhelming numbers, forcing the Americans to retreat. The failed invasion of Canada brought an end to America's military ambitions in the north. The retreat from Quebec was disorganized and unpleasant. Smallpox ravaged the ranks and discipline began to deteriorate. The Americans retreated to Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point in New York, abandoning any hopes of annexing Canada. The Battle of Quebec had numerous long-term consequences. Strategically, it ensured that Canada remained under British control throughout the conflict. The defeat deterred future large-scale American incursions into Canadian territory, forcing the Continental Army to concentrate on defensive operations. It also solidified the loyalty of many Canadians to the British Empire. Carleton, for his part, had earned the gratitude of the British government and the respect of his adversaries through his capable leadership. The battle exposed significant flaws in American planning, logistics, and command coordination. Though Montgomery was hailed as a martyr and Arnold received brief acclaim for his bravery, the overall campaign was viewed as a reckless venture that cost many lives while accomplishing nothing. However, the Battle of Quebec marked a watershed moment in the Revolutionary War's international dimensions. It demonstrated the limitations of American expansionism and the difficulties of conducting operations in foreign territory without adequate support. The French-Canadian population's refusal to rebel undermined the American belief in a universal desire for liberty. Many Canadians were wary of the Protestant American forces and questioned their intentions. Furthermore, the British had promised to protect the Catholic Church in Quebec, and clergy frequently encouraged their congregations to remain loyal to the Crown. This mismatch between American expectations and Canadian realities contributed to a broader sense of American isolation in the early stages of the war. Symbolically, the battle became part of the mythos of early American resistance. Montgomery was remembered in speeches and songs, and Arnold, despite later becoming notorious for treason, was regarded as a daring and heroic figure. The image of soldiers marching through the snow, enduring hunger and cold for the sake of liberty, became part of the revolutionary story. However, beneath the romanticism lay a sobering lesson in military overreach and the dangers of assuming ideological unity across cultures and colonies. In retrospect, the failure at Quebec did not end the American Revolution, but it did significantly reduce its geographical scope. The Continental Congress had to accept that the rebellion was limited to the 13 colonies. The defeat highlighted the need for enhanced training, improved supply chains, and effective coordination among commanders. The bitter experiences of early campaigns, such as the one in Canada, greatly influenced the military professionalism that Washington and others would later instill in the Continental Army. Furthermore, the campaign demonstrated the importance of weather and terrain in warfare. The harsh Canadian winter, combined with the city's fortifications and Carleton's tenacious defense, created conditions that no amount of bravery could overcome. The failure to take Quebec also slowed and complicated any future American diplomatic efforts with foreign powers, such as France, which closely followed the campaign. Later American victories, such as Saratoga in 1777, convinced France of the viability of the revolutionary cause. In conclusion, the Battle of Quebec in 1775 was a daring, desperate gamble that resulted in a humiliating defeat for the American revolutionaries.